Anybody who's ever slapped a big fat ribeye on a grill has opinions about steak. How to season it, how to cook it, how to know when it's done. And the fact is, most of these opinions are based on lies. Well, steak myths, really.
So we're gonna grab our thermometers, scales, timers, and notebooks and head into the kitchen to sort out fact from fiction.
The cowboys from clowns.
The meat from the gristle.
The backyard heroes from the backyard zeros.
I think we've made our point.
Right. I'm Kenji Lopez-alt.
And I'm Katie Quinn.
And on today's episode of the Food Lab,
Steak Lies.
Many people believe that you should take your steak out of the fridge early and allow it to come to room temperature before cooking it.
After all, you want your steak to cook evenly from edge to center. So the closer it is to that final temperature before you cook it, the more evenly it'll cook.
And not only that, but it's actually gonna brown better as well because you don't have to spend any energy taking off that chill from the fridge before the steak hits the pan.
So it all seems to make sense, but does it really work?
Well, we're gonna set up a very simple experiment to find out. So we have a steak that's straight from the fridge here. Right now at its center, it is about 37 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit.
So proponents of this method suggest leaving it out for 20 minutes. So I'm gonna go grab a coffee, you do whatever it is you do, and we'll see you in 20. Minutes later, and we're at right around 40 degrees.
Yeah, so that's about 2 degrees difference. That's less than the difference between your fridge and your neighbor's fridge. So what if we let this go longer, say about 2 hours total?
Let's do it.
Now, after 2 hours, our steak is finally up to around like 49 or 50 degrees, I'd say. Now, that may seem like a big difference, but it's actually less than 20% of the way towards our final serving temperature of 125 degrees.
So what about surface temperature, you might be asking? Doesn't the surface get warmer, thereby making it easier to sear? Well, we'll sear this steak side by side with the steak straight from the fridge and see what happens.
Let's do it. Now, both steaks are at 125 degrees. Both of them took about the same amount of time to cook, and both of them are really well browned. And then if we cut them open,
they look pretty much the same. Let's dig into these.
Let's have a little taste.
And they taste pretty much the same too.
Yeah, they do.
So no real advantage to leaving it out even for 2 hours.
Yeah, that's because surface temperature is not what matters, surface moisture is what matters. It takes about 500 times more energy to evaporate 1 gram of water than it does to raise that same gram of water by 1 degree Celsius, and you can't brown the surface of a steak until that moisture has been driven off.
So in other words, when it comes to browning, it's the dryness of the surface that matters, not the temperature.
Exactly, and if you want a really great steak, your best bet is to actually take the steak, put it on a rack, leave it in the fridge uncovered overnight or even up to a few days so that the surface gets really nice and dry. That way when you go to sear it the next day, you develop a brown crust in record time.
People feel really strongly about searing their steak. The thinking goes that a good sear with really high heat right at the start of cooking will seal in those delicious juices.
You're basically cauterizing the surface of the steak, and a cauterized surface doesn't leak, right? So it makes sense. The problem is it's actually not true, and not only that, it's the exact opposite of what you want to really be doing.
Luckily, there's a pretty easy way to disprove this tragic misconception. So let's take this New York strip steak. Should be pretty well seared. Let's see it.
Give me a nice sear on the first side. Now let's watch this top surface as it cooks. and see what happens.
Look, there are juices coming up from inside the steak right through that seared side.
Those juices are definitely not sealed in at all.
Another steak myth exposed.
But people still say that searing first gives you better flavor. So what we're gonna do is test that. We have two identical New York strip steaks right here. The first one we're gonna sear in a hot skillet, and then we're gonna place it on a rack in a tray and finish it off in the oven until it hits 125 degrees. The second steak, we're gonna start it in the oven and then finish it with a sear, also to 125 degrees. So if the theory is correct, the one that's seared first should lose less moisture. Let's see what really happens.
Let's do it.
So the steak that we pre-seared actually ended up losing more moisture than the steak that we seared right before serving.
And not only that, but cut them open and you find that the steak we seared just before serving is actually more evenly cooked from edge to edge.
Exactly. So if you want the best steak, you should start by cooking it in a gentle oven around 275 degrees, or on the cooler side of a grill. Cook it to within about 10 degrees of its final target temperature, then give it a nice hard sear just before serving. I call this method the reverse sear, and I guarantee that it's going to give you juicier, more evenly cooked steak every time.
Hey, Kenji. Kenji, come on, man.
You know, when I go to a steakhouse, I always like to order at least one big, fat, juicy, bone-in rib steak.
Well, that's because a bone-in rib steak is way more flavorful than a boneless ribeye, right?
Well, that's what I used to think, and it's true that there's definitely a lot of really flavorful meat on the bone if you're willing to get a little messy and dive right in. But some people say that the bones actually add flavor to the meat as well.
Yeah, this is kind of crazy to me. I mean, do bones really have more flavor than meat? If there is some kind of a flavor exchange happening, shouldn't the flavor from the meat also be pushed into the bones?
Yeah, and science-wise, what's really going on? How are these large organic compounds getting pushed around? I mean, what's the mechanism?
So what we could do to test it is cook a boneless ribeye next to a bone-in ribeye, but it might not give us the full picture. I mean, there might be something else at play.
Yeah, instead what we're gonna do is we're gonna cook 4 steaks. The first one we're gonna cook with the bone in as is. The second we're gonna remove the bone. The third we're gonna remove the bone, then tie it back on. And then the fourth we're gonna remove the bone and tie it back on with an impenetrable layer of aluminum foil in between.
And that should tell us whether or not there really is some exchange of flavorful molecules or if there's something else happening.
Let's do it. So we want to taste a bit of meat from the opposite side of the bone, and then also from the same side as the bone, and see if there's any real difference there, because if there is anything going on, we would expect it to be different from the bone side to the opposite side, right? So we've tasted the steaks, and to me, the one with the bone in tastes a little bit juicier close to the bone, and the one with no bone tastes about the same all the way around. But the ones with the bone tied on and the one with the aluminum foil also seem juicier close to where the bone was tied on. And because of that foil, we know that there's no way it was actual movement of juices from one place to the other.
So the real advantage to the bone is insulation. The edges of the steak are the parts that cook most, and the more you cook them, the more juice they lose. So all the bone does is prevent the steak from coming into hard contact with the paint.
Even say like a ceramic rod that you tied to the side of a steak would accomplish that exact same goal. But you know, it's still really nice to have that bone because obviously there's all these nice crispy brown bits, and that's the best part of the steak. Plus they just make you look badass, I think.
Badass. But make no bones about it, the rest of the steak tastes exactly the same.
That's a terrible pun, Katie.
Well, you know, you wrote it, so.
I did.
If there's any single hot tip you hear about steak more than anything else,
And we mean every single person we've ever talked to or cooked with gives you this one.
It's that you should only
Flip
your steak
once.
That's it. Put it on the grill or in the pan and don't touch it until it's time to flip.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, I don't really know where this came from. Does it make a better steak? Does it cook more evenly? Do you get a better crust? I mean, aside from a perfectly practical perspective, what's the point?
Right, like cooking in a restaurant or something.
Yeah, so if you're gonna cook about 30 steaks at a time, it makes sense to only flip them once in the middle just so you can keep track of them.
But when you're at home with a couple steaks, it's easy to flip them as much as you want.
Exactly. So what we're gonna do is a little experiment. So I've got this New York strip steak right here. We're gonna season it with salt and pepper and then cut it in half. One half we're gonna sear, only flipping it once through cooking. The other half we're gonna sear in the same skillet, flipping it every 15 to 30 seconds. We're gonna let both of them rise to 125 degrees. We're gonna take them out and compare the results. Now both our steaks are out, and first things first, the one that we repeatedly flipped actually came to temperature slightly faster than the other one, and that's a plus in my book.
But make no mistake, the only thing I care about is how it tastes.
Oh man, who writes this correct?
Anyway, we're gonna cut them open and take a look.
All right. So you can already see that one of them is slightly more evenly cooked than the other. The one that you flipped just once actually has a slightly bigger band of gray meat around the edges.
And the one we flipped repeatedly is more evenly cooked.
Yeah, that's because when you flip repeatedly, you're basically approximating cooking it more gently, but from both sides. And more gentle cooking means more even cooking. And you can still get that same nice brown crust.
Though to be fair, the one that was flipped only once looks pretty darn good too. So if you're used to just flipping once, keep doing that.
Right, but if you see your friend at the grill flipping their steaks over and over, they probably know what they're doing too, so don't flip out at him.
Oh my gosh. We busted some big steak myths, but there are still plenty out there.
Yeah, but even so, you can cook a steak any way you want it, so long as you follow a few simple rules.
Right. Our technique is to season the steak really well, then put it in the fridge uncovered on a rack overnight. Then pop it in a 250-degree oven or on the cooler side of the grill until it reaches about 10 degrees below the desired serving temperature.
Then just before serving, you want to give it a nice hard sear in a skillet with hot butter and oil or on the hot side of a grill.
Then let it rest and it's ready to serve.
Yeah, the one thing you really want to remember though is always use a thermometer because you do not want to be that guy who messes up the $30 steak.
That's right. You might even say...
You might say that the stakes are high.